Hello, welcome, and thank you for viewing my presentation. My name is Tim Wilson. I use he, him, his pronouns, and while I serve as the Dean of Student Affairs and Interim Assistant Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Equity, I'm coming to you today as a finalist for the position of Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management and Student Affairs here at UW-Bothell. As part of the interview process, each finalist has been asked to provide a presentation on a given prompt, and this is the product of my efforts. Now, before we get into the presentation, I want to take just a minute to provide you with a glimpse as to who I am as a person. In no particular order, I am an educator, the youngest of three boys, Chief Student Affairs Officer, a California native, a supervisor, an advocate, a proud spouse and parent, published, and called to serve my community, lead with integrity, and move the needle in positive directions. Now, the prompt that we'll be working with today is as follows. Given the changing higher education landscape caused by the global health pandemic, shifting demographics, and evolving workforce needs, what do you see as the most significant opportunities and challenges for a diverse, public, regionally serving, community-engaged institutions such as UW-Bothell? What do you envision for an Enrollment Management and Student Affairs Division to respond to this new world? So my approach for answering these questions is to frame everything around three questions of my own. First, what do we already know? How do we know it? And then how could or should we respond? So let's start with what we know already. In my opinion, we are in the midst of at least two major pandemics, COVID-19 and a pandemic of racialized trauma. And while students, faculty, and staff in our community have performed brilliantly, these pandemics have resulted in increased stress, isolation, grief over lost opportunities, relationships, and/or loved ones, and fatigue stemming from the sheer effort to reimagine and convert in-person activities into remote ones, whether they be teaching, learning, or service provision, as well as reimagining the in-person operations that couldn't be replicated remotely. The pandemic's impact on our communities, especially when we consider its disproportionate impact on marginalized communities, is simply staggering. In regard to demographic changes, we know that we are in the midst of an impending demographic cliff. And this refers to something that started to take place around 2008, the time of the Great Recession. And that's where birth rates started to decline in response to a worsening economy. Now, the economy rebounded for a while, but birth rates didn't. And as a result, the number of high school graduates that are set to go to college has been declining since 2012. And by 2029, that decline could be as much as 15% or more in certain parts of the country. Additionally, our society is going through a diversification of its own. By 2045, people of color will be in the numerical majority for the first time in this nation's history. And that's going to require us to do a lot of thinking and a lot of changing in regard to the narratives that we use to guide our work, to guide our presence here. When it comes to, the evolving workplace, we figured out a lot of things during the pandemic. We figured out how to recruit students remotely. We figured out how to provide orientation for students remotely. But it's important to remember that not everybody went home during the pandemic. Campus safety, facilities and maintenance, residential life staffs, they all continued their work in person on campus because that was the nature of their jobs. And in so doing, they reimagined processes down to the most granular level in order to keep staff and students safe and healthy. So as we return to the workplace, it's not going to be realistic for us to believe we can or should return to the way things were before the COVID pandemic. So I think the questions before us are, what aspects of remote work should we keep? And what will work look like in the new normal as we return to the workplace? So let's focus on how we know these things. And I think this slide here is really going to be representative of the fatigue and stress the faculty were experiencing in the initial stages of remote work, but also sheds light on how they believe that students were faring. So what I'm referring to here is a survey that was conducted in spring 2020 with UW Bothell faculty. And 81% of the respondents to that faculty noted that they were spending a lot more time on average each week prepping for their courses in the spring than they did in prior quarters. And when they were asked to rate the ease of learning in such an environment, with 1 being pretty easy, no change, and 5 being much more difficult, we see here that 3/4 of the respondents, maybe a little more than 3/4 of the respondents, thought that it was going to be much more difficult for students to learn in this newly developed remote learning environment. If we stay really in the same area, but now we're referring to a different survey, the survey was conducted on students. It's the 4th and 5th week survey that's facilitated by the Student Success Center, and it was facilitated in spring 2020 and fall 2020. And as you look at the survey, the purple bars represent spring 2020 and the gold bars represent fall 2020. So as we look at the impact on class performance and participation, and we look at these select areas of pandemic stress, time management, mental health, and finances, we notice that stress about the pandemic and mental health issues increased for students in the fall. But you'll also notice that time management was less of a stressor in the fall as well, probably because students were getting accustomed to being in remote learning situations. You'll also take a look at finances. You see where students' stress about finance, at least was reported to be less, but it's important to note that in the fall, we knew that the need, the demand, the desire for emergency funds was through the roof. So much so that the benefits hub on campus had to work with the United Way of King County to obtain more emergency funding just to keep up with the demand. And that's one example of the heroic work that was done not only by the benefits hub, but by student financial services to help lower the stress that students were feeling around finances. But you have to understand that that was a significant effort to help keep students focused on what they needed to do so they wouldn't have to necessarily worry about money. Referring to the same survey, and in looking at student interest, performance, and engagement, and looking at the areas of engagement and interest in daily activities, effective interaction with peers and faculty, and being able to keep up with assignments. And again, purple bars representing spring 2020, gold bars representing fall 2020. And all of these selected aspects, you see things improved for the respondents in fall 2020. And I think a lot of that comes from improvements in remote learning and engagement experiences, but also efforts from entities like Student Affairs and other campus partners to secure funding for enhanced mental health services, to enhance the PAC coaching program, and efforts made again by the Benefits Hub and Student Financial Services to secure additional emergency funding from the United Way. All those things made a difference. And again, there were significant efforts to put together. While all this is great information, I realize that there's at least a gap in my knowledge, in that we have very little information on how the pandemics impacted institutional staff experiences. I think it's safe to say that staff have also experienced high levels of stress, just like students and their faculty colleagues. But I'm not aware of a data set in regard to understanding how staff experience the pandemic. And that's really, again, a gap in knowledge. And it's important for us to have a better understanding of staff experiences because staff are key to institutional success. They help operationalize policy directives and they keep processes moving. So that's something to where if I'm chosen to be vice chancellor, and even if I'm not, I really do want to work with other partners around campus to better understand the staff experience. Now, as we look at shifting demographics, again, taking a look at the demographic cliff, this is a map that was developed by an economist and professor out of Carleton College. His name was Nathan Graw, and it shows what the losses will look like in terms of the numbers of students that will be going to college by 2029. And as you can see, there's a lot more loss that's happening east of the Mississippi than there is west of the Mississippi. Professor Grob predicts that regional bachelor's institutions will lose more than 11% of their students by 2029. And again, if you take a look at our part of the country, the loss isn't expected to be as bad. We're looking at 2.5 to 7.5% losses. But if you look at Seattle, if you look at Portland, there's a prediction that will actually increase the number of students that will be ready to go to college by 2029 in this time of declining enrollments and declining birth rates. So that's good news for us. So in thinking about what we can do, with our positioning, you have to remember that we are in great position to respond to these challenges in some really unique and innovative ways. And the things we have going for us in terms of our access orientation, our community engagement efforts, and our strong commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that puts us ahead of the game. And we're in a good position to be able to come up with some great solutions. So as we think about shifting demographics societally and becoming a BIPOC majority, it means that equity and inclusion has to be at the heart of our work. And DEI work isn't an add-on. I am keenly aware as an African-American man that when colleges and universities were created in this country, they weren't created with me in mind. They were created to preserve the privilege and the immunity of rich, landowning white males. And I am none of those. So understanding that, it becomes important to me personally that our institution serve as a constant counter to that original narrative. And we can do this in large and small ways. When we ensure that every bit of data that's collected by the Division of Enrollment Management and Student Affairs can be disaggregated by race, gender identity expression, and other forms of identity, that's a way in which DEI work becomes at the heart of what we do. When we continue to support our standing committee for diversity and equity that we have in student affairs, when we continue to support the mentoring circle for staff of color, when we continue a conversation that we had prior to the pandemic, where we were talking about ways in which we could create mentoring circles for staff who identify as women, when we are still open to the possibility of creating even more mentoring circles for folks based on their identities, especially those marginalized identities, those are the ways in which we center DEI work. When we make sure that when we're going through and making policy decisions, when we need to understand the way that some of our decisions are impacting us, that we go to those communities we're most concerned about and we ask them directly, how is this working? How is this going? When we build relationships with communities of students on campus, as well as with individual students, these are ways in which we can put the DEI work at the center of what we do. When we do these things, our division and our institution has an opportunity to fully live into our potential and again, to expand higher education's original narrative. Now, going back to the demographic cliff, if you remember the map, the losses for Western states are going to be less significant than the losses for Eastern states east of the Mississippi. And while it's good news for us, I know that enrollment managers are smart people, and they're going to look at that map and say, Pacific Northwest, that looks like a pretty good place to recruit students. Therefore, it's going to be necessary for us to position ourselves to prevent a brain drain. As much as I love my home state of California, I am not interested in seeing our talented students leave Washington for California, for Oregon, for Idaho, for Montana. I want to make sure that the experiences that we are able to provide are so enticing and so unbelievable that it will be very difficult for our students in this state to go elsewhere. In addition to doing those things, I think we've got to strengthen our relationships with our feeder institutions, whether they be high schools or whether they be community colleges. And we've also got to double down on telling our story. One thing that I'm doing already is that when we develop our annual reports in student affairs, I make sure that I send them out to my counterparts at community and technical colleges. And I do this because I want UW-Bothell to be top of mind when they're working with their staffs, when they're talking with students who may be thinking about transferring someplace else to complete a bachelor's degree if that's in their plans. I want UW-Bothell to be on the tip of their tongue to say, hey, you ought to check this place out. They're doing some good things. Now, that's just one strategy, and I would love to be able to pair that with other strategies that already exist in enrollment management. But even with all of these strategies, I think the one strategy that's really going to help us out during this time is strengthening our retention efforts. They're going to be more important than ever. And as we strengthen retention, I think about the time that I've spent co-chairing the university's retention committee. And every once in a while in committee meetings, we would think aloud and we'd say, wow, it would be great if we could map out the undergraduate student experience, whether it's the first-year students, regardless of their age, or whether it's transfer students, just mapping it out so we can understand the ebbs and flows. And as I think about this now in this context, I get more and more excited about this possibility. And I think to myself, what if we did commission a group to map out this experience? And then that group was able to surface 4 or 5 significant milestones that each UW-Bothell graduate encounters on their way to graduation. Okay. And then what if we went a step further? What if we said, within each of those milestones, what are those key tasks that need to be completed in order to move from one milestone to another? That creates deeper understanding of not only what the milestones are, but what it takes to achieve them. And what if we went a step further? What if we said, we want to form interdisciplinary teams to develop programs and other services and strategies to help students accomplish the task within each milestone and to move from one milestone to another in as smooth a fashion as possible. And when we put these teams together, we ask ourselves the question, who, regardless of title, regardless of division, regardless of the work that they do on campus, who possesses the expertise to help students achieve these tasks, achieve these milestones, and keep moving from one milestone to another? I think doing something like that really excites me. And if I'm chosen to be the Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management and Student Affairs, I would really want to see this come to fruition and see how a strategy like this pairs with other strategies that I know are taking place not only within the division, but with our partners as well. So as we think about the evolving workforce, early in my tenure as Dean of Student Affairs, before COVID-19, we were thinking aloud, at least as a division, about what it would look like to have more flexible work from home options. And we wondered aloud, additionally, what would it be like if we had online students that were completely online? How would we provide service for them? How would we go about onboarding them through orientation? The pandemic has shown us that we can do these things. Now, I'm not saying that what we produced was perfect over these last few months, but there should be no question anymore as to whether or not we can do it. We can. And over the past 12, 15 months or so, we have developed an understanding as to what works, what doesn't work, and those give us breadcrumbs on the path to creating something that is different. And I'll tell you something, we're not the only ones thinking this way. This number right here, 47, that's the percentage of faculty respondents who agreed or strongly agreed that they wouldn't mind teaching some of their courses remotely in the long term. And again, this is the winter 2020 faculty survey. Now, I know that number isn't the majority, but it's larger than I thought. And it demonstrates that there's a willingness, that there's a know-how to reach students in ways that we hadn't been able to do before. It's something that we should keep in mind as we return to the workplace and we start to think about what that new normal looks like. As Vice Chancellor, I would really want us to take steps to embrace this opportunity to create a new normal, to provide flexibility where we can, and understanding that whatever flexibility we develop is going to be influenced by evolving health and physical space standards, as well as the type of work that we're talking about. Um, I really want to emphasize that what will look good in terms of remote options for in-person work, what will look good in some areas like career services or the counseling center, that may not be completely workable in an area like residence life or admissions. But what I'm committed to doing is saying, okay, what should the foundation be? What should the floor be in terms of providing remote options to our in-person work? And then figuring out what it looks like in each area, understanding that it will differ because the types of work that we do differs. But I'm committed to engaging them in that process of figuring that out. And again, as I said earlier, and I'll repeat it, I think it's worth repeating, I'm really committed to learning more about the staff experience and learning about it in a more deliberate and systemic way. You know, at my previous institution, we participated in something called the Great Place to Work Survey. It's a survey that's administered all across North America with organizations, and it really focuses in on how staff experience an organization. Now, I don't know that we'd be able to put together the resources to fund this solely for enrollment management and student affairs, but I think a survey like that provides a great model for us to build in collaboration with institutional research, in collaboration with general staff organization, to build something where we can regularly survey our folks and find out how things are going. And I wouldn't want to just rely on a survey. There's other things that we can do to be in contact with each other, to be getting constant information and feedback. But I think the intentionality behind something like this would do wonders, from my understanding, I think would do wonders for the institution as well. So as we return to the workplace, I believe there's three things to remember. Again, let's incorporate the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic. Next, we need to pace ourselves when we come back in person. You know, we're not going to be able to throw a switch and return to work as if nothing happened. We're going to need to relearn a number of lessons, whether it's being in physical space with each other, having an actual commute, regardless of what that looks like, dressing for work, adjusting our daily bio clocks, addressing the stress and anxiety that's going to come with physically returning to the workplace. This is all going to take time. So we have to be patient and realistic. And gradually, we will work our way back as a personnel team. And again, let's embrace this opportunity to create a new normal. We have a chance to address some of the things that either felt unhealthy or that were undesirable in the way that we worked prior to the pandemic. And we have an opportunity now to address that and see if we can make it different as we return to the workplace. I want to take a minute here to show you the references to the sources that I use for my presentation, whether it's the surveys or the article on the looming higher ed enrollment cliff. And I want to thank you again for spending some time with me here. And I look forward to meeting with you all at the open forum.